My God, why is this happening right now? David Wellington barked into the phone, his voice ricocheting off the sleek glass walls of the 45th floor at Wellington Industries. The Billionaire CEO paced frantically, glancing out his panoramic office window as a convoy of 3 sleek black sedans came to a stop at the building's main entrance, releasing delegates from one of China's leading tech giants. Moments earlier, the official interpreter had abruptly cancelled due to an unavoidable family crisis. In just under 15 minutes, the visiting executives would take their seats in the boardroom to finalize a $180 million agreement, an outcome that hinged entirely on flawless communication. Mr. Wellington, I've contacted every reputable translator in the city, said Rebecca, his executive assistant, still clutching her phone with increasing desperation. No one can make it on such short notice for a deal this critical. David tugged at the knot of his designer tie, feeling the heat rising in his collar. 2 decades of building his empire could unravel because of a language disconnect. The Chinese delegation was known for their rigid communication etiquette. Any reliance on apps or last-minute improvisations would be seen as unprofessional. Then, a quiet, almost hesitant voice emerged from the far corner of the office. "Excuse me, Mr. Wellington," came the soft interruption, "but I speak fluent Mandarin." Heads turned simultaneously toward Jasmine Parker, a 28-year-old janitorial staff member who had momentarily paused her routine. Dressed in the standard Navy maintenance uniform, she clutched a cloth in one hand and stood near the doorway, her presence almost ethereal in its humility. For 3 years, Jasmine had worked on the upper executive floors, always efficient, always discreet, often unnoticed by the very people she now addressed. The room went still, the faint hum of the ventilation system becoming strangely loud. Rebecca was the first to respond, letting out a brittle, dismissive laugh. "Jasmine, this isn't the time for jokes. We're discussing a multi-million-dollar international negotiation." David's gaze locked on her, almost as if he were seeing her for the very first time. "You speak Mandarin?" he asked, disbelief and urgency coloring his voice. "Mandarin, Cantonese, and a bit of Taiwanese," Jasmine replied evenly, her eyes steady and unflinching. "I majored in East Asian linguistics at Howard University, before circumstances led me here." She hadn't imagined that her years spent cleaning boardrooms would be the unexpected training ground for a moment like this. Yet in that time, she had absorbed every conversation, every corporate strategy, every subtle power play, especially Rebecca's. Rebecca's expression shifted from amusement to barely concealed annoyance. "You can't possibly be thinking of letting her handle this meeting, David. She's a janitor." But David was running out of options, and something in Jasmine's quiet certainty made him pause. He said finally, "Say something in Mandarin." Jasmine inhaled slowly, then spoke with fluid grace, her Mandarin flawless and resonant. "Women hen gauxing neng zai zeliu jianimen, siwang women de hezuo neng dai lai shuangying de jeguo." Though David couldn't understand the words, the authority and elegance in her tone needed no translation. "What did you say?" he asked, stunned. "That it's an honor to meet you here, and we hope our cooperation will bring mutually beneficial results," Jasmine translated smoothly, her voice carrying a natural grace. "It's a standard formal greeting, very respectful in their culture." Rebecca crossed her arms tightly, clearly unsettled by how things were unfolding. "David, seriously think this through. What are they going to think when you bring in the janitor to handle one of the most important meetings of the quarter?" At that moment, a flash of memory surged through Jasmine's mind. Months earlier, she had overheard Rebecca in the executive restroom, whispering on the phone about that black girl always hovering near the boardrooms. Jasmine had pretended she didn't hear, but every word had etched itself into her memory. Now, as David looked at Jasmine with quiet intensity, something shifted. He wasn't just seeing a cleaner in a navy blue uniform anymore. He was seeing intelligence, composure, and a presence that stood its ground without fanfare. For years, she'd been invisible in these rooms, yet listening, learning, absorbing every pitch, every deal, every nuance of how business was done. "You've got 20 minutes, David said finally, his voice decisive. "Get ready and meet us in the conference room." Rebecca's eyes widened, her lips curling in disbelief. "You've officially lost it," she hissed under her breath. "When this blows up, don't say I didn't warn you." But David wasn't paying attention to her anymore. For the first time in years, he was trusting someone outside the inner circle. Jasmine didn't waste a second. When she returned, exactly 19 minutes later, silence swept through the room. Gone was the uniform. She wore a sleek black outfit, borrowed from the receptionist, modest yet sharp. Her curls were neatly tied into a low bun, and she held a notepad in one hand like she belonged there. Thomas, the CFO, did a double take. "You're kidding," he muttered. "That's her?" Rebecca leaned toward the assistant and whispered loud enough for nearby ears, "You can polish a rock, but it's still just a rock." Jasmine didn't flinch. The conference room buzzed with quiet Mandarin chatter as the 5-member Chinese delegation took their seats, all perfectly tailored suits and practiced professionalism. David welcomed them warmly, offering each a handshake before motioning toward Jasmine. "This is Jasmine Parker," he said confidently, "our specialist in Asian markets and international affairs." Not a single mention of janitorial work. Mr. Chun, the delegation leader, bowed respectfully, and Jasmine responded in flawless Mandarin, complimenting their timeliness and expressing gratitude for the opportunity to host them. His eyes lit up in genuine surprise, then softened with a pleased smile. It was clear in that moment. The meeting hadn't even started, and Jasmine had already earned their respect. For the first 15 minutes, Jasmine translated each phrase with flawless precision, not just linguistically, but with full awareness of nuance, tone, and the quiet subtleties that made their guests laugh sincerely and nod in approval. What should have been a tense negotiation felt surprisingly natural, flowing like water. That's when Rebecca struck. "Jasmine," she said, with a sugary smile that didn't reach her eyes, "don't you think we should share your unique journey here at the company with our guests?" David looked up sharply, clearly displeased, but Rebecca kept going. "It's really quite touching, watching someone climb the ladder the way you have. Humble beginnings." Her voice dripped with smugness. That old familiar ache twisted in Jasmine's stomach, the kind she'd known since she was barely out of high school, when she left Howard halfway through her junior year to take care of her mother after the hospital bills started piling up. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She looked straight at Mr. Chun and said evenly, "Life tends to present its chances in unexpected ways." Rebecca, undeterred, pushed further. "Still, it's impressive. Just think. 3 years ago, she was cleaning these very rooms. And now, here she is. Diversity in motion, wouldn't you say?" The words lingered in the air like smoke. Mr. Chun's smile didn't disappear, but something behind his eyes shifted. Respect was being quietly replaced by curiosity, by doubt. In a culture where formal titles and professional status carried heavy weight, this revelation had landed poorly. David tried to step in. "What Rebecca meant to say is that we invest in people who show real skill, regardless of their title." But the meeting never quite regained its rhythm. Jasmine felt it immediately. The tone had changed. They were still kind, still attentive, but no longer relaxed. Now she was something to study. A novelty. Not a partner. And that's when it clicked. 3 years. 3 years she had moved quietly through these glass offices, soaking in every word from behind her mop bucket, storing every careless lie, every inflated figure, every unethical shortcut these polished professionals thought no one noticed, especially Rebecca. Jasmine remembered when Rebecca doctored sales reports to secure a client, or when she passed off another employee's months of work as her own, then cut them loose for budget reasons, or when she used inside information to negotiate a personal investment deal. Jasmine had been there for all of it, had seen it, heard it, and most importantly, kept it. When the meeting ended, the Chinese team offered a polite, "We will review the proposal internally and follow up." Translation, if nothing better comes along. Rebecca practically glowed as she stacked her files. "Well," she said, smug and theatrical, "that certainly went differently. Maybe next time we lead with transparency about our team's credentials." David's jaw tightened. Before he could speak, Jasmine stood up, calm, steady, like someone who had nothing to fear. "Rebecca," she said softly, her tone unreadable. "Mr. Chun mentioned something as he was leaving." Rebecca glanced up, her smile faltering just slightly. "Oh, really?" "Like what?" Rebecca asked, arms still crossed as if her authority were being questioned. "He mentioned being impressed by my command of Mandarin," Jasmine replied, her tone calm but resolute. But he also said he was puzzled by the structure of our team. She let that sink in for a beat. He was curious why the person facilitating communication wasn't introduced as the lead, since in his culture, the speaker usually represents the authority figure. Rebecca's face twitched, just enough to betray her discomfort. Jasmine added with a faint smile, "He asked if I could call him later to explain our internal hierarchy. He wants clarity before proceeding." The color drained from Rebecca's cheeks. For years, Jasmine had existed quietly on the periphery, unnoticed by the powerful, dismissed by the proud. But now it was clear. She had been listening, watching, absorbing everything. While others underestimated her, she had turned their arrogance into fuel. Every time someone rolled their eyes or dismissed her potential, she took mental notes. And in those 3 years, Jasmine hadn't just cleaned offices. She had memorized conversations, identified patterns, traced decisions to consequences. Most importantly, she had learned how the company truly operated, what was said publicly, and what was buried in whispers. 2 hours after the meeting, she was back in her uniform, pushing her cart down the familiar carpeted hallway of the executive floor. But her mind was elsewhere. Her presence was the same, but her awareness had shifted entirely. She could replay every whispered deal, every hushed phone call, every printed report left in the printer by accident, especially the ones that came from Rebecca's office. And Rebecca, emboldened by a false sense of victory, couldn't help herself. "Look who's back in her element," she announced loudly to Jennifer from accounting. "I guess the boardroom debut didn't quite go as planned. Some people just don't belong at the big table." Jasmine kept her eyes down, wiping a polished table surface as if the comment didn't land. But every syllable lodged in her memory. Because what Rebecca didn't know was that Jasmine had seen her switch contract terms last year before presenting them to a startup, one that mysteriously collapsed weeks later. Or that she'd overheard a late-night phone call about skimming bonuses and pushing the blame on a junior manager. Jasmine knew where all the skeletons were buried and had quietly compiled them. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced down discreetly and saw a message written entirely in Mandarin. It was from Mr. Chun. "Miss Parker, I would like to continue our conversation in private. I believe your insights and values align with ours. Could we meet tomorrow morning at the Mandarin Cafe on 42nd Street? I have a proposal I believe will interest you." Jasmine stared at the screen. Her heart pounded, not from shock, but from confirmation. This wasn't about translation anymore. This was recognition. Chun had seen past the uniform, past the assumptions, past the office politics. He had seen capability, strategy, integrity. Later that evening, Jasmine sat in her small Brooklyn apartment and opened a folder labeled simply Foresight. Inside were years of documentation, screenshots, audio clips, and written notes. Evidence not only of misconduct, but of how power moved inside Wellington Industries. She hadn't built it out of spite, but necessity. Not revenge, just insurance. For a day just like this. Every company hides skeletons in its closet, and spending 3 quiet years cleaning offices on the top floors had given Jasmine rare access to whispers, documents, and moments no one thought twice about. Hidden in a labeled folder on her flash drive titled Wellington Red Flags were 63 pages of carefully gathered evidence, screenshots of emails Rebecca believed she'd erased, time-stamped call logs from late-night strategy sessions, and sharp, incriminating photos of contracts she had intentionally sabotaged, specifically 3 deals that would have benefited black-owned firms. In just the last year and a half, Jasmine had watched Rebecca lie straight to clients, steal credit from junior staff, and manipulate internal decisions to block promotions for people she considered not the right fit for the company's image. The next morning, precisely at 10 a.m., Jasmine stepped into the Mandarin Cafe wearing the same navy wrap dress she once bought with leftover scholarship money. Mr. Chun greeted her with a respectful nod, accompanied by an impeccably dressed woman who introduced herself as Lisa Wong, Vice President of International Expansion. "Miss Parker," Chun began in English before smoothly switching to Mandarin, "you showed more than fluency yesterday. You demonstrated grace when others would have cracked." Lisa added, "We're building a North American team. We need someone who gets both business and culture, someone who has seen the truth behind the boardroom glass." Chun smiled faintly. "And someone wise enough not to bow to loud voices in empty suits." For the next 2 hours, Jasmine spoke with clarity and precision, offering insights into American corporate behavior, cross-cultural nuance, and how Asian investors are often misread by Western firms. She referenced market patterns, hinted at industry misconduct, but named no names. When Lisa slid a sleek card across the marble table, it read, Parker and Associates Global Strategy. Below it, the proposed salary was 5 times her current income. We'd like you to join our team, Lisa said. But with one key task to begin, help us untangle certain inconsistencies in Wellington's global contracts. There's concern that international trade regulations have been breached. Jasmine nodded, her hand steady as she held the card. After being overlooked and dismissed for years, she now had 2 of Asia's top executives offering her not just a title, but a voice. Wellington's board has called an emergency meeting, Lisa added quietly. The Chinese delegation has submitted a formal grievance. If you show up tomorrow, you might want a front-row seat. That evening, Jasmine called her mom. Remember when you said a smart woman's best defense is patience? Of course, baby, her mother said. Jasmine looked out across the Manhattan skyline, glowing gold in the sunset. Because now, I finally get it. Tomorrow, Wellington Industries and Rebecca would learn that 3 years of silence had built more than a witness. They had created a quiet tactician who had studied every flaw in the empire and who was ready, finally, to play her hand. And unlike the executives who judged people by what they wore or where they stood in the office, Jasmine had come to understand that real power lies in watching quietly, preparing patiently, and choosing the precise moment to strike when no one sees it coming. The next morning, the top floor of Wellington Industries was thick with tension as board members took their seats, murmurs flying about the Chinese delegation's complaint and the looming possibility of federal scrutiny. David had called the emergency meeting himself, pacing near the windows with clenched fists. Rebecca walked in like she owned the building, her red suit crisp, heels sharp, convinced she'd spin the narrative in her favor. She launched into her monologue with smug authority. Well, she said, scanning the room of 7 board members, as I warned you all, putting an untrained employee at the center of such a high-stakes meeting was bound to backfire. And now we're looking at a $200 million fallout. Just as the room tensed, the door clicked open. Jasmine entered in a sleek gray outfit, no longer the uniformed worker they once overlooked, but a poised professional with a briefcase in hand and purpose in her steps. Apologies for the delay, she said evenly, settling beside David. I needed to finalize a few documents for today's discussion. Rebecca blinked, caught off guard. With all due respect, David, she said, voice tight. Why is she even in this meeting? This is an executive-level conversation. David's response was ice. She's here because the Chinese delegation asked for her directly. They want clarity on the irregularities they uncovered. Jasmine opened her laptop, her movements slow, deliberate, in complete control. Mr. Chen reached out to me yesterday, she began, her voice calm but cutting, to share concerns about unethical practices embedded in recent contracts, practices that include sabotage and manipulation of competitive bids. Rebecca shot up in her chair, the panic starting to crack her polished exterior. This is absurd. What would she possibly know about internal strategy? Jasmine's smile was subtle, razor sharp. The kind of information you collect when no one sees you. When you've been walking these halls for 3 years and people speak freely, assuming you're part of the background. A flicker of fear passed across Rebecca's face as Jasmine connected her laptop to the projector. The first slide displayed an internal email dated 6 months ago. Rebecca had shared proprietary information with Mills Corporation, tipping the scales against a direct rival. Gasps broke the silence. And here, Jasmine continued, unfazed, is documentation of budget manipulation, Rebecca inflating project costs specifically on initiatives led by Black and Latino staff, then blaming those failures on team performance. Her voice didn't waver. The truth, finally spoken aloud, hung heavy in the room. The screen lit up with files, spreadsheets clearly edited, emails that had never been meant for public eyes, and audio pulled straight from the company's own security archives. Jasmine had kept everything, quietly collecting it over the past 3 years. This is a setup, Rebecca shouted, springing to her feet, her voice sharp with panic. She's twisting this to ruin me because I told the truth about her role here. Jasmine didn't flinch. Mr. Wellington, the next clip is from the security feed, recorded 8 months ago. Then, without another word, Rebecca's voice filled the boardroom. We can't have people like her sitting in with executives. It's about maintaining the company's image. The blood drained from Rebecca's face. She remembered saying it, behind closed doors with Thomas, thinking no one would ever hear. And this, Jasmine added, clicking to the next file, was captured just 2 weeks ago. Another recording played. Rebecca giving quiet instructions to the front desk to quietly lose resumes that looked, in her words, too ethnic. Mr. Johnson, a black board member who had been with the company for over a decade, leaned forward, visibly angry. "Rebecca, is that true?" She fumbled, her face shining with sweat. "It's being taken out of context. I was just under pressure to maintain standards." Jasmine didn't even look up. "The company's standards include fairness, legality, and basic human decency, none of which you've upheld in nearly 2 years. David turned to her, his jaw set. "You have 30 seconds to give me one reason I shouldn't fire you and hand this all to federal prosecutors." Rebecca's eyes darted around the table, desperate for someone to back her up. No one moved. No one met her gaze. "You're making a mistake," she whispered, her voice cracking. "She's just a cleaning lady, for God's sake." "No," David said, his voice sharp and final. "She is now our Director of International Relations, and you're done." Silence crashed over the room as Rebecca stood frozen, her career gone in a heartbeat. "Your access ends now," David added. "Security will help you clear out your desk. And Rebecca, every file is being turned over to federal investigators." As 2 guards escorted her out, she shot Jasmine one final glare, venomous and trembling. "You may have won today, but we both know what you really are." Jasmine didn't blink. "Yes," she replied calmly. "I've always been the same person. Quiet, watching, waiting. The difference is, now I have a seat at the table where I belong." Hours later, as the board meeting adjourned and Jasmine was officially promoted, David pulled her aside. "How did you even manage this?" he asked. 3 years of proof? All of that?" For the first time in a long while, Jasmine smiled. "When people treat you like you're invisible, they forget you can still see and hear everything. Rebecca bet on her position. I bet on patience." She turned to the window, the Manhattan skyline sprawling before her. And in that moment she realized her greatest victory wasn't taking Rebecca down. It was finally rising where no one thought she belonged. The future ahead would no longer be dictated by others. Jasmine Parker would carve it herself, and this time no one could wipe her name from the page. Half a year later, she sat behind her sleek glass desk on the 38th floor of Wellington Industries, poring over multilingual contracts in Mandarin, Cantonese, and English, deals that had already brought in over $400 million from Asian partners. "Ms. Parker, the South Korean team just arrived," Jennifer announced, now serving as her dedicated assistant. "They're excited to meet the woman who tripled our Asian portfolio in under 6 months." From her office window, Jasmine looked out over the city that once loomed above her while she worked unseen. Now, as Director of International Relations, she was one of the most recognized executives in Manhattan. Her new $300,000 salary meant her mother could afford the best diabetic care available, and Jasmine had just completed her master's through Columbia's executive program. "And the Forbes panel next week?" Jennifer asked, scrolling through her digital calendar. "Confirmed," Jasmine replied, adjusting her deep navy blazer. Not because she had to, but because she chose to. They wanted to feature her among the nation's most influential young women in business. Meanwhile, across the East River, Rebecca sat in a cramped Queens apartment she'd been forced to rent after losing her luxury condo. Therapy invoices stacked beside the coffee-stained couch, mixed with a dozen rejection letters from firms unwilling to look past her name, now synonymous with discriminatory misconduct thanks to headlines splashed across major business outlets. The $50,000 federal fine and 5-year executive ban had cemented her downfall. Earlier that morning, she'd seen Jasmine's face on the cover of Business Week, smiling with Chinese executives beneath the bold headline, "The Interpreter Who Rewired Global Business." The irony felt brutal. Back at Wellington, David had gathered the board to present the record-breaking quarterly results. "Jasmine didn't just rescue the Chinese deal," he said proudly. "She unlocked entire regions we never imagined entering." Mr. Johnson, the seasoned board member who had witnessed Rebecca's collapse, rose to speak. In my 4 decades navigating corporate America, I've seen few shifts as powerful as the one Jasmine ushered in. She proved, without question, that real brilliance doesn't come wrapped in privilege, rank, or skin tone. It comes from perseverance, intelligence, and courage no one sees coming. The applause echoed throughout the boardroom, yet Jasmine remained quietly composed, her thoughts drifting back to the version of herself who had once scrubbed those very floors just 7 months ago. That evening, in her newly renovated Upper East Side apartment, she picked up the phone to hear her mother's familiar voice. "Sweetheart, I watched your interview today. You spoke so beautifully about resilience and new beginnings." Jasmine smiled. "I learned it from you, Mom. You always said people can try to make us feel small, but they can never take away what we know or what we're capable of becoming." During that televised interview, when asked whether she held any bitterness toward Rebecca for how she'd been treated, Jasmine's answer was poised and unshakable. "Rebecca gave me something priceless," she said. "She showed me exactly what I never want to become. Her prejudice and pride taught me that real strength is in lifting people up, not standing on them." Just 3 weeks later, Jasmine stood before an auditorium at Howard University, her former campus, to announce a new scholarship initiative aimed at supporting students forced to pause their studies due to financial strain. "No one should have to choose between their family and their future," she told the crowd of 500 students, many wiping away tears. The Second Chance program, partially funded from her own earnings, had already granted 20 full scholarships for the upcoming term. Across the city, in a modest apartment in Queens, Rebecca watched the live broadcast, her fingers trembling as she shut her laptop. For the first time in months, her tears weren't from shame, but something slowly resembling remorse. Meanwhile, Jasmine returned to Wellington Industries, walking the same halls where she once pushed a cart, unnoticed. Now, junior executives greeted her with respect, colleagues sought her insight, and she personally mentored 5 employees from lower departments who showed remarkable potential. "You know what surprises me most?" David said one afternoon in a quiet conversation. "You could have used what you knew to destroy Rebecca's reputation entirely, but you only exposed the parts tied to her misconduct." Jasmine's reply was simple. "The most powerful form of justice isn't revenge. It's creating something so extraordinary that everything they tried to use against you becomes meaningless." Jasmine Parker's journey stood as living proof that true talent, grace under pressure, and unshakable dignity can outshine even the darkest biases. She had transformed years of being overlooked into the most powerful asset of her career, proving that sometimes the ones quietly observing are the ones destined to lead. Rebecca had tried to diminish her out of ignorance and fear, only to become the instrument of her own downfall. In the end, Jasmine rewrote the narrative of success, showing that leadership isn't about titles or status, but about recognizing greatness where others refuse to look. And for those who found hope in her story, remember this: dignity and talent don't ask for permission. They find their way, no matter how many walls stand in the way. "My God, why is this happening right now?" David Wellington barked into the phone, his voice ricocheting off the sleek glass walls of the 45th floor at Wellington Industries. The Billionaire CEO paced frantically, glancing out his panoramic office window as a convoy of 3 sleek black sedans came to a stop at the building's main entrance, releasing delegates from one of China's leading tech giants. Moments earlier, the official interpreter had abruptly canceled due to an unavoidable family crisis. In just under 15 minutes, the visiting executives would take their seats in the boardroom to finalize a $180 million agreement, an outcome that hinged entirely on flawless communication. "Mr. Wellington, I've contacted every reputable translator in the city," said Rebecca, his executive assistant, still clutching her phone with increasing desperation. "No one can make it on such short notice for a deal this critical." David tugged at the knot of his designer tie, feeling the heat rising in his collar. 2 decades of building his empire could unravel because of a language disconnect. The Chinese delegation was known for their rigid communication etiquette. Any reliance on apps or last-minute improvisations would be seen as unprofessional. Then, a quiet, almost hesitant voice emerged from the far corner of the office. "Excuse me, Mr. Wellington," came the soft interruption, "but I speak fluent Mandarin." Heads turned simultaneously toward Jasmine Parker, a 28-year-old janitorial staff member who had momentarily paused her routine. Dressed in the standard Navy maintenance uniform, she clutched a cloth in one hand and stood near the doorway, her presence almost ethereal in its humility. For 3 years, Jasmine had worked on the upper executive floors, always efficient, always discreet, often unnoticed by the very people she now addressed. The room went still, the faint hum of the ventilation system becoming strangely loud. Rebecca was the first to respond, letting out a brittle, dismissive laugh. "Jasmine, this isn't the time for jokes. We're discussing a multi-million-dollar international negotiation." David's gaze locked on her, almost as if he were seeing her for the very first time. "You speak Mandarin?" he asked, disbelief and urgency coloring his voice. "Mandarin, Cantonese, and a bit of Taiwanese," Jasmine replied evenly, her eyes steady and unflinching. "I majored in East Asian linguistics at Howard University, before circumstances led me here." She hadn't imagined that her years spent cleaning boardrooms would be the unexpected training ground for a moment like this. Yet in that time, she had absorbed every conversation, every corporate strategy, every subtle power play, especially Rebecca's. Rebecca's expression shifted from amusement to barely concealed annoyance. "You can't possibly be thinking of letting her handle this meeting, David. She's a janitor." But David was running out of options, and something in Jasmine's quiet certainty made him pause. "Prove it," he said finally. "Say something in Mandarin." Jasmine inhaled slowly, then spoke with fluid grace, her Mandarin flawless and resonant. "Women hen gauxing neng zai zeli yu jian nimen, siwang women de hezuo neng dai lai shuangying de jieguo." Though David couldn't understand the words, the authority and elegance in her tone needed no translation. "What did you say?" he asked, stunned.